Stefan, State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Finance in the German government. Gordon Bynum, the largest private investment group in infrastructure, is that the right way of describing it, in the world, perhaps? And Matthias, but to get our discussion going, Basil Hudak, would you like to give your thoughts on what Werner Hoyer had to say from Slovakia's perspective on investment in Slovakia?
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. I hope we will have another good day, fruitful day of discussions at the TATRA summit. I think the topic of this panel is very important and actually very much in line with what are the priorities for Europe, but also for the Slovak government. As President Hoyer was speaking, I was kind of going in my mind through some of the in my experience in the state sector, and as you know, I was before in the Ministry of Finance, and we were also kind of silently talking with Tomáš Štefan, because we spent many hours and nights and days during the EFC, WG, and Eurogroup meetings.
We all miss you.
Yeah, I miss you as well. Too many hours together, then get used to it. It becomes a family. So anyway, I was thinking about year 2012. Everything is falling apart. Greece is bad. Spain is coming on board. Cyprus, you know it, President, very well. And in Slovakia also, the new government comes to power. The immediate goal is to somehow stabilize the public finance and get the house in order, because this is really what we have to do. Otherwise, the whole Eurozone may collapse, and the countries inside as well. So that's one kind of snapshot. For us, this was a challenge to put public finance in order, to get deficit under 3%, to stabilize the situation with the public debt, and to exit excessive deficit procedure where we went into at that point. Now, another snapshot for me is September 2014. We were just talking that it was a meeting of the ECOFIN in Milano, in Italy, and actually one of the main promoters of the austerity, Minister of Finance of Germany, I was quite surprised when he said that, look guys, we have been successful with stabilizing our public finance. We did a lot. Greece is in much better shape. Spain is doing very well. Actually, economy starts growing. But what we have to do now is to shift our focus from austerity or focus on public finance or to how do we promote economic growth. Because austerity was not the goal for its own purpose. The measures which we had to adopt to put public finance in order were only de facto the necessary measures to put situation in such shape that we could focus on economic growth. And I think this was the kind of first element of what became the investment plan for Europe, and then was translated into the Juncker package and eventually led to EFSI and all those activities that President Hoyer described. So for me, this was a very interesting kind of evolution of thinking at the top of the European level, and I was very happy to be part of this individually, and also with my shift from Ministry of Finance to Ministry of Economy, where I focus much more on economic growth. I'm happy that we got, in terms of the European situation, to this stage. Of course, it doesn't mean that focusing on economic growth decreases the importance of public finance, of making sure that our house is in order in terms of keeping the basic rules of fiscal management and public finance management. Now, what it means for Slovakia, I can say very proudly that we were, as Slovaks, we were actually in the front run of some of these developments. Already back in 2013, when we were very much in the consolidation, kind of austerity mood, we were thinking, okay, how do we actually plant some seeds for future economic growth? Because we did feel what was described as the gap in investments and innovations. And we came up with the idea of so-called Slovak Investment Holding, which is in a way a national Slovak incarnation of EFSI. So the government decided to put aside 3% of the EU funds which are coming to Slovakia during the new programming period 2014-2020, so around 500 million euro into a special vehicle called Slovak Investment Holding, whose purpose is to manage these funds, but especially to identify viable commercial bankable projects and to attract private financing to those projects. So for us, this is a very interesting instrument which can do what the FSI should do as well. It means to use public money in a smart way, either it's through guarantees or through risk-sharing instruments, and so that we can mobilize more private financing into economy. We are now in the situation where we have analyzed opportunities and the needs in the Slovak economy. We have submitted to the EFSI around 40 projects. There is a kind of pipeline which has been created for the European Fund of Strategic Investments. These 40 projects represent around 11 billion euro. It shows that there is a need for financing in Slovakia, a need for investments. We have also launched a heavy modernization and innovations program agenda through the government, through the Ministry of Finance, which includes also support for SMEs and in particular for so-called startup companies. So I think the overall situation is that Slovakia is very much in support of those activities that EIB is doing. We are also working closely on financing for the PPP highway, so-called ring road around Slovakia, R7D4 ring road. Also, I can say that Slovakia is going to contribute 400 million euro to the EFSI through co-financing of the projects, which will go to the EFSI using the funds from the State Development Bank and the Slovak Investment Holding. That's very much for introduction from my side.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thomas Stefan, Werner Hoyer set out very clearly the investment challenges for Europe. I mean, Germany is often accused of failing, firstly, to invest in its own infrastructure and a lack of investment in its domestic market, but also clearly there is this sort of wider European challenge. Do you agree with Werner Hoyer's assessment and the Juncker plan assessment of what the priorities are and the method that's going about, the way that these problems are being addressed? Do you think that this is the right solution for Europe?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And of course, I could be very brief and say I totally share Werner Hoyer's view and hand on the floor to the next speaker. But just to give you a, let's say, more comprehensive and hopefully also more consistent picture in the way of what are the main elements that Werner Hoyer really stressed and pointed out, because it's always important to have a narrative for Europe. And the narrative is not just one element. The narrative consists of many elements. And by the way, congratulating the initiators of the TATRA summit for selecting the right headlines. I looked at the agenda of the last two days. It's about Europe really being at crossroads. And it's really about how to keep Europe together. And it's about the priorities for the incoming presidencies, where we have to address the main challenges of today and of tomorrow. And Vasil already mentioned some of the solutions to address these challenges. I would like to summarize from a German perspective that there are always three elements. It's a kind of trio. I wouldn't call it troika, but maybe trio is the more neutral name for that. It is what he mentioned as austerity. I would call it fiscal consolidation. So we have to go on with that kind of fiscal consolidation for the simple reason that Europe has to be credible. And the debt levels, the public debt levels, are much too high, especially in the Eurozone, with beyond 90% of GDP. So this is ongoing work, I would call it, just to be credible to the outside world. And the second element it's about implementing structural reforms. And the third is about how to foster viable investments and how to bring private investments in. And there's one underlying, let's say, principle for all these three elements: consolidation, structural reforms, and viable projects. And this is what sometimes we both suffered a lot from in many, many European discussions. It's not about announcing something. It is exactly what Werner Hoyer said. It's let's just do it. Let's implement structural reforms. Let's really go on with growth-friendly consolidation. And let's really bring private investors in, because it's true what was said, the public funds in future times will never be enough. So it's, again, not about announcing, not about discussions. It's about just let us do something to bring Europe forward. And that is why I would like to illustrate, that was part of your question, what Germany is doing and how Germany can contribute to the ongoing process. And Werner Hoyer mentioned a lot of pillars. Let me maybe add 4 more pillars, and there is a lot of overlap between all the pillars. But the first one is, I guess, that countries in Europe, and Basel has given a lot of good examples from the Slovakian point of view, that the countries have to do their homework. It is true that Germany has to invest more. My minister announced another 6-8 billion euros 2016-2018. And by the way, we just had our draft budget for 2016 in Parliament. And of course, we have to invest a lot in human resources and refugees, how to train people, how to better integrate people in the German labor market. That will be quite costly from a point of view of today, but in the medium to long run, I guess it will be an investment in not just our economy, but also in the European economy. So it's on the national basis, people have to do their homework to promote projects and investments. And the second pillar is that, of course, all our countries are not living on an island. Germany is very much aware of that we have to better cooperate and coordinate our projects within Europe. That is why we push our KfW, which is our promotional bank, to better cooperate with many, many other promotional banks in Europe and in the Eurozone. So they have global loans and other arrangements in the area of 3 billion euros in place. And I guess we have to increase that to better coordinate our projects within Europe. This is the second pillar. The third pillar is, of course, how can we contribute to the EFSI? Our expectation is, again, through KfW, that we will contribute in the area of 8 billion euros to the EFSI projects through various instruments. And the first ones had been launched in September. So this is a clear commitment by Germany and the German government and the KfW to support the EIB, to cooperate with the EIB, and to make the FC a success. And then there is a fourth pillar, and in my view, this is the most important pillar. It's very much, again, in line with what Werner Hoyer said. If the 3 first pillars are, let's say, quantitative pillars, the fourth pillar must be the qualitative pillar. How to improve the investment climate in Europe, how to convince Asian investors to come to Europe or to come back to Europe and to invest money in Europe. This is the crucial point. So this has a lot to do with deregulation, fighting bureaucracy and red tape. And sometimes I have the impression that the Commission has started in the right direction last year. And maybe, I don't know, Mr. Timmermans, who is in charge of deregulation, for example, I guess he's very much also busy with refugees. I very much hope that the Commission will continue with that fourth pillar to really build the narrative and to convince outside investors to come to Europe and to invest in Europe, to foster growth and to create jobs.
Thank you very much. Well, that neatly leads on to Gordon Bynay as an investor. Werner Hoyer was very clear that, well, firstly, he acknowledged that the world is currently awash with liquidity. So there's no sort of shortage of money in the world looking for investment opportunities. He was very clear that the EIB is not crowding out investment, it's crowding in. I was interested, as an investor, do you feel crowded out or crowded in by what you've been hearing this morning?
Thanks for the question. I always have to remind myself that I'm not sitting on the government side, because I've been there, done that, got the lousy T-shirt, but now I have to represent the private sector. No, had enough.
You're welcome back.
So yes, I was very pleased to hear President Hoyer's speech, because I think it has underlined again that the Juncker plan has the right starting point. The Juncker plan comes from the recognition that the real problem is not the lack of money in the market. The real problem is the lack of projects. I think the fundamental recognition in the approach of the Juncker plan is that governments cannot take on more debt. They actually should reduce all the debt that was amassed as a result of this crisis. But on the other hand, as Larry Summers put it in an article recently, there is one territory where there is free lunch, which is good quality public infrastructure investment, because it generates short-term and long-term growth, increases competitiveness, if you can finance it from other than public indebtedness. And that's why it's a good combination in the Juncker plan to say we put in a little public money to generate much more private investment. So it's the right approach. And on the other hand, it's also trying to reflect a very substantial problem of most of the European countries, that our public retirement systems or private savings-based retirement systems and our private health saving systems are unsustainable at the current levels of interest rate. Simply there is no real rate of return for those insurance companies and pension fund managers to keep up the viability of their retirement system. So they need to find projects where there is some kind of a real rate of return, there is some IRR. So there's an enormous pressure of private money trying to find projects in Europe, bankable, viable projects. They would be ready to finance these projects at historically low levels of interest rates because they can't buy more government debt. So matching this supply of money with the need for more infrastructure investment is the perfect match. The question is, and that's where the EIB is coming in, they have to be the matchmaker. And that's their role. Not so much providing more money, because there's a lot of money on the ground. But the best use of the EIB's money is to help governments produce projects, because there is a lack of viable projects in Europe. And especially, I think EIB has a specific role, as the President has said it, is to find those risk elements that may hold back investors from investing. But if we talk about the lack of projects, I think generating projects is in the hand of the national government. The EIB cannot produce projects. Private investors can only come if the project is there. And there are some bureaucratic problems, or actually counter-effective regulations these days. And I'm watching with great interest the Timmermans project of the third pillar of the Juncker plan. Just to give you one example. While we say we need more investment, PPP style, with private money supporting public purpose, for example, the recent changes in the Eurostat regulations, which have practically made almost all PPP projects to be part of the government balance sheet in terms of debt, is completely counterproductive. We are, as Meridian, we are investing all around the world, North America, Europe, including Turkey and Africa. And what we see in Europe, many governments are actually holding back starting projects, for example, in Scotland, Belgium, Spain, because they are afraid that those projects, which were previously not part of their government debt, because they were true PPP projects, where the risk was really on the private side, are now classified by the Eurostat, or questionable or clearly classified as government debt. There is one other, even more tricky issue, which is a bit more slippery than this one. When the Juncker plan was started, there was an initiative to say those projects which are approved by an all-European grand jury, to say these are really of European importance and can stimulate growth. Those could, the government cost attached to those projects over time could be somehow exempted from the Maastricht criteria. This idea was thrown out very quickly, because certain governments probably didn't like the idea or thought it as it's an easy way to loosen up the rules. But on the other hand, you would get an incredible supply of quality projects if you got these rules, because many governments in Europe are suffering with, obviously, with the Maastricht criteria, so they are trying to save on even on the quality infrastructure projects. These are two regulatory issues that are causing the bottleneck of projects when the money is there and trying to find its place.
Very interesting. Thanks. We'll come back to that point. I think it's worth exploring. But first of all, I wanted to ask Matthias Wojtok. Werner Hoyer again was just talking about the EIB's role in this world awash with liquidity as addressing market failures. But I'm a bit puzzled by this idea of market failure, given that the cost of capital is so cheap. Is it just that the market's simply incapable of producing projects that, without the EIB's help, that can create a return, or is it that the governments can't create projects at a price they would like? Is it just simply a question of pricing, or the fact that the projects just can't be done at all with private money?
Thank you, Simon. I think the choreography is quite interesting here, because Werner Hoyer set the tone and actually gave the vision. Then public and private sector talked, and the people who are actually on the ground, we need to listen. And I think listening is actually what we are about to do. Our bank is a bank, as in such, actually has limited means in creating projects. But these means, we need to use them as a catalyst to address the issues that were raised by all previous speakers. And that is, I think, changing the investment environment, changing the investment psychology, if you want, is a very important message. And we need to not only actually address, we did address the liquidity issues in the past, we now need to address a totally different set of issues. That is, of course, last TATRA summit was addressing the problems of where are the projects, and there was desperate outcry, we need to have these projects. Now, it is a question of confidence and investors' confidence. And this is not only, we need to ask who are the investors? We have different sorts of investors, and states and member states are, of course, a very important set of investors. They invest in their own capital stock. They actually go out and want to have infrastructure that brings the country forward. So they need to see an interest in doing this type of investments. They need to see a return. And this return is actually one of the most striking criteria that EIB will look at if we finance a project. So we will look at the economic rates of return of this type of investments. Now, do we need to do that in particular countries only? No. I fully agree with Mr. Steffen that the big economies also have their roles to play in terms of investment climate, in terms of leading the way, in terms of creating examples, and choosing also the right projects. We have seen infrastructure transport investments in highly rated countries in Europe that have economic rates of return of 30% and above. So that is actually a very good indicator that the public side should mobilize its energy and potentially its money to actually realize these infrastructures. Now, we are often faced with the question on and off balance sheet. Are these actually drivers to do infrastructure or not? And I think, again, we sometimes had a very puzzled view on, let's say, the risk transfer, which is intrinsic, for instance, in the German PPP models, that would allow, or would have allowed actually in the past, an off-balance sheet treatment. But for reasons that are political reasons in this country, they were chosen not to be put outside the balance sheet, but they stay on the balance sheet. Now, the main driver for using PPP models is value of time and quality of execution. So what we are doing is actually going out, talk to people, listen to people, try to identify projects that are useful, that have high economic rates of returns, and where we can make a difference in terms of creating confidence that these projects will find a market because they have the backing of an EU institution, because we have an exchange on methodologies of how to evaluate, how to procure, because we have a dialogue, and we are fulfilling our advisory role, which is coming on top of our lending and blending role. Afterwards, we need to think about how can we maximize what we are doing. So we think about financial instruments. With FC, we are entering a phase where financial instruments is getting a new dimension. This is not like we're not doing patchwork. We really need to address key issues in terms of drivers to invest. Of course, I mean, we will not or rarely find a project where EIB is the only driver to say, okay, we do it, we participate, and that's why the project is going to come up. But we need to be in constant discussions with all sides to actually convince people that, yes, this is good to do. Our role is then to take, it's very difficult, let's say, for people on the ground to strike the right balance between crowding out and risk-taking and making this particular difference. So that is what we are right now busy with, is to try to find this balance, to make people actually, let's say, willing to invest, willing to procure, to actually create this pipeline of projects, and of course afterwards to finance it. So we somehow need to play a catalyst role, but not too heavy actually, in order to not crowd other investors out. And these investors are, of course, when we talk about crowding out, we're talking about people who would do the same thing than us. There's financial investors who actually want to go into the debt structures. So I think a very important thing is that, and the message also, is that this bank is currently sort of reinventing itself. Taking up the challenge means that we actually change also our business model. I think the numbers that Werner Hoyer cited were quite important because we did high-risk end transactions in the order of up to 5 billion per year. We are going to do 4 times more. So that is the signal where we actually go into a change mode. And that is very important. And we can only do it if we continue to have this dialogue with all involved sides. It's particularly nice actually to have Vasil here, and I think the experiences that Slovakia has produced are absolutely outstanding because they are at the forefront of using the idea of financial instruments in order to try to create an investment environment. And I think, at least for the small piece of the way that we could accompany Slovakia in this particular road, we consider this to be an extremely successful way to do it.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to come back to Vasil actually because you know I actually moderated a similar panel here at this summit last year on this topic, pre the Juncker plan and pre FCs, and the very clear message, you know, then on that panel was again the lack of projects, but and it comes to the point that Thomas Stefan was making that about creating the right investment climate, and what people were discussing then was that some of the real blockages were actually to investment, things like corruption, poor regulation, weak insolvency regimes and legal systems, or access to justice for investors. I mean, I wonder, you know, you've got these 40 projects, but what, but how, you know, would you accept that those are still the big blockages? Is the EIB and the Juncker plan really just trying to subsidize poor governance? Is that the issue here? And what are the blockages to investment? Are there still blockages in Slovakia, for example? Would you accept that those are really where the real challenges lie?
Well, I agree, and I think that Tomáš Stefan put it in the right way, that we have this kind of quantitative elements which have to be put in place. It means there has to be basically the money channeled either through national budgets or through national development banks or through international development institutions, into the projects which are viable and which would also encourage private sector to participate. But there has to be the qualitative element, which is basically the investment climate, which has to become, and which has to be conducive enough for private investors to get engaged. As far as Slovakia is concerned, of course I cannot say that we are in an ideal position. I think it's a kind of marathon exercise where you go and you improve, you deregulate, you decrease the bureaucracy, you get rid of the corruption wherever it exists, and it is really a process which takes a long time and takes efforts from all different different parts of the state administration. It's not only Ministry of Economy, it's not only Ministry of Finance, also construction permits and many things of this type. One thing which we are introducing in Slovakia, which I believe will help in this process, is so-called regulatory impact assessment. So basically, the government approved a procedure where each legislation which is going to be adopted in Slovakia has to go through this regulatory impact assessment, actually to be performed by the Minister of Economy, which means that we will be looking at each legislation from the point of view of its impact or potential impact on entrepreneurial environment, business environment, whether it's positive or negative. And I think this will help us to kind of pre-screen and filter the legislation even before it is introduced and made as a law. One thing which I want to mention is that EFSI and the whole kind of pro-investment move which we are talking about now in Europe, and which is really necessary for making Europe competitive within global economy, has to be also supported by what I would call cross-border projects. And I think one, maybe Matthias can correct me, but one complaint I have received so far from the EIB people and people engaged in EFSI is that there are many national projects, which is good, and this is probably the base, but there are too few cross-border projects. And we do need to strengthen the European identity by this kind of cross-border project, whether it's in energy area, infrastructure, transport, or innovation area. I mean, we need to, and we had actually a very interesting discussion yesterday during the lunchtime with ministers and also private sector representatives from Central Europe, V4 plus Austria, talking about the fact that we should find a way how to bring together the different elements of innovation clusters even within Central Europe, whether it's in biotechnology, whether it's in IT or any other areas. So I think this is also a piece of the agenda where we need some kind of encouragement from governments. We need to create a conducive environment for private sector, and we have to kind of pull forces together.
Yeah, I wanted to come on to this question of cross-border, I think, because it's clearly crucial. And I'd like to ask Thomas Stefan, what, from your perspective, what you see happening at a European level to try and foster a better cross-border investment climate. But before I come to you, perhaps Matthias, you could briefly tell us, within these projects you're looking at, how much cross-border element there is in that.
I mean,
just put us in the picture for.
No, the European Union actually has a cross-border roadmap, at least for transport and energy infrastructure, and that is the Trans-European networks. So, of course, most of these, let's say, in the energy sector, most of the cross-border relevant projects, they are regulated businesses. So that is like gas or electricity interconnectors. Now, these are, by definition, nationally based. So there is no particular incentive in a lot of countries, let's say, there is no particular incentive for such a transmission system operator to actually invest into cross-border projects that are maybe more complicated and that at least require coordination with another TSO. So complications are there, and the use of cross-border investments is not necessarily equally arriving at each side of the border. So you might have something, an infrastructure that is actually benefiting one country, but the cost of it would actually be split 50-50. So these are the real problems that we need to address. National regulators will need to find a political will to address these issues, to incentivize TSO to do so, or to create regulatory regimes that are standalone for cross-border investments. In which particular case, of course, EIB would be ready to step in and say, we will take regulatory risks under EFSI and try to support these investments.
I was really hoping for a number. How many? How many projects?
I couldn't tell you.
You
I need to say,
A very small number or a very large number?
I mean, cross-border is not actually the stretch of infrastructure that crosses the border, one needs to say. I mean, cross-border in transport infrastructure, it's defined as corridors. So everything that we do in the transport sector is actually on these corridors. That is like an eligibility criteria for us. So transport and most of the energy projects that we do in transmission, they are part of the larger scheme of trans-European networks. So in that sense, I would have a tendency to say 100% is actually on these cross-border accesses, without actually having, let's say, the link that goes over the Rhine or over the Danube or whatever it is. Sometimes also we do that, but I mean, in that sense, really, it's 100%.
I see.
But can I just
Very briefly.
Very briefly, I just want to avoid the impression that FC is only there for infrastructure. I mean, Werner Hoyer pointed it out. We are talking about a whole variety of sectors that we want to invest in and spur private investments. And that is not only infrastructure. That is, of course, the energy sector. This is, of course, innovation. This is, of course, access to finance for SMEs. But it is also industry. So we also see balance sheet constraints in industry investments, where ring-fenced investments will be necessary, power generation, things like that, which is also something that EIB will be able to support through FC. So that was just a little correction in terms of image I wanted to give.
Yes. Can I come back to Thomas? What do you see that Europe could be done at a European Union level usefully to encourage more cross-border projects? And I suppose partly I would throw in banking union as part of that. To what extent banking union, completing that is an essential step in terms of creating a cross-border investment climate, maybe capital markets union too. But anyway, what do you think the European Union can be doing to help at that level create a better investment climate?
Yeah, this is a very important question. Let me briefly introduce the response by saying, first, on the FC, I think we discussed several times, but we all concluded that there should not be geographical quota under the FC. So whatever is viable and would bring private investors in, we should really support, especially, of course, cross-border projects are very much welcome, and that is why I said on a bilateral basis, maybe again we have to encourage our promotional banks to work closely together, because they are quite close to the real business. They can maybe also help to better identify cross-border projects. And the second point is, of course, very much linked with the capital market union. I think one truth just in this room is that sometimes listening to the Commission, I have the impression that people really think that the internal market in Europe is working. It's not. And of course we have to do our utmost to strengthen the internal market. Sometimes it's just a question of European customers and consumers, because they don't care about the European internal market. They just buy local products, which of course is very much welcome. But again, we have to do more to get the benefits out of the internal market. And the capital market union by Commissioner Hill is an important, again, another pillar in this comprehensive picture, because it has one essential aim. If there are hurdles in future times because of regulation, and maybe also because this regulation, bank regulation, is necessary, because it's a learning curve out of the financial crisis 2008, if the banks are not able any longer in future times to finance the economy and giving credits to SMEs and others, then we need alternative ways to find this kind of funding and financing. And this again brings us back to the capital market union, to find better ways, especially for SMEs, to access the capital market. This is very much about transparency, ratings, sharing of risks and SMEs, and so on and so forth. This is about promoting financial instruments, which of course had been very much criticized in the crisis, like securitization, high standard securitization, and so on and so forth. So very much convinced that this is the right way to go. And the role of the state and the role of the countries, in my view, is a limited one. It's about the catalyst role that we mentioned. It's about supporting investors. It's all about risk sharing. And in my view, it's not about copying the mistakes of the past. What we did over the last 20 years is that some of our European countries had 3% of their GDP financed by European structural funds. And what happened? It's exactly, they invested in infrastructure. That means the third highway, but no traffic running on the highway. These are the mistakes of the past. And that is why we always stress viable projects rather than just projects. And that is why I guess we are all in the duty to really listen to private investors and to identify what are the hurdles, what are the obstacles, what are the blockages. If the Maastricht criterion is a blockage, let's discuss that. But please, not in the way that the Commission sometimes tends to discuss it, that first we have more flexibility through an investment clause, then through another clause, which is of course called the structural reform clause. Now we are talking a third clause, which is called the refugee clause. The fourth clause, I guess, will be the so-called Christmas clause. You know, so this is the wrong way to go, because it would not foster credibility in our system. But we really have to look at the important things. And I have noted that maybe we both should talk to Eurostat on the booking on public accounts, the question of PPPs, what kind of part should be on the public accounts, what part should be on the private accounts. So this is a very concrete and precise issue that I'm more than happy to take home and to clarify.
Very good. Gordon Weiner, you wanted to come back in
Just on the cross-border thing, because the whole of the European Union was founded on the idea that if countries in Europe share critical infrastructure, markets and regulation, they are less likely to go war against each other. So that's a very core of our European project. Now, a lot of things have happened, and still border crossing capacities in energy, for example, are very relevant, especially in the Central Eastern European part, where the dependence on energy, especially oil and gas, is huge. But one thing I wanted to raise here, there was a great initiative a year ago by Angela Merkel on what we call the Berlin process. Werner Hoyer was referring to that, how to integrate the Western Balkans, how to keep the Western Balkans looking at Europe and not looking east, which is the problem. If somebody is standing too long in a queue, they have the idea of joining maybe another queue which goes faster. So how do we do that? And the Western Balkans project, the core issue, if you talk to the prime ministers or ministers of economy of the Western Balkan countries, is infrastructure, connectivity. And if we could create in the Western Balkans cross-border projects, and there are roads there, for example, the road coming from Croatia via Montenegro to Albania, another one that goes from Serbia through Kosovo to Albania. If these cross-border projects could be realized with the help of the EIB and the other international financial institutions and private investment, that would completely change the landscape, the political landscape of the Western Balkans. So infrastructure can very quickly deliver, not very quickly, quite slowly, but it can deliver very significant political results. And therefore cross-border is relevant also at our neighborhood, especially at times when people think that the critical infrastructure in the Western Balkans is raising fences at the borders.
Yeah. We're running quite low on time. If there was anybody who wanted to ask a question or make a point from anybody? No? Okay. No one wants to stand up, defend the Commission against against Thomas.
Or Eurostat.
Or Eurostat, for that matter, yes. Okay. Thomas Stefan, at the very beginning, I was very struck that Ivan Leze referred to the EIB as potentially a macroeconomic stabilization tool. I was wondering if that was something, an ambition that the German government shared for the EIB.
I'm not so sure whether the EIB would like to have that role. Maybe you should ask Werner Hoyer again whether he would really assume this kind of role. But of course it goes without saying that the EIB is one element and one instrument in that sense that we have to better make use of our European instruments in place. It's not the instrument from a macroeconomic point of view. Otherwise, we would make another mistake, in my view, that we always concentrate on the European level. We concentrate on a kind of European fiscal stance, and we create maybe another expectation on the European level. It only goes together, in my view, and I guess this is very much in line with what's said in this panel, together with the homework and the elements that can be done on the national level. Europe is still, to some extent, a union very much based on the national competences. Many of us would think that we should have better progress on the European level in the sense that we need more European competences also in that respect. But we are not yet there. We are willing to go into that direction, but as long as Europe is